Welcome to the IT Interview Challenger channel. We provide a collection of questions and answers primarily focused on IT knowledge to help you prepare for upcoming interviews, practice for exams, or just boost your professional skills. We hope you'll find real value from tuning in.
A company collects large amounts of temperature, humidity, and pressure data daily from multiple global sites. They want to quickly aggregate this data in a single Amazon S3 bucket with minimal complexity. What's the best approach?
The best approach is to enable S3 transfer acceleration on the destination bucket and use multi-part uploads to directly upload the data.
A company has JSON-formatted application logs stored in an Amazon S3 bucket. They need to analyze these logs with minimal changes and operational overhead. What would you suggest?
I would recommend using Amazon Athena directly with Amazon S3 to run queries as needed.
A company has EC2 instances connecting to an Aurora database using locally stored usernames and passwords. They want to reduce credential management overhead. How would you address this?
I would recommend using AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store with automatic rotation, enabled to manage credentials securely and efficiently.
A company is migrating a 200 GB SFTP server using an NFS-based file system from on-premises to AWS, specifically to an EC2 instance with Amazon EFS. How would you automate this migration?
I would launch the EC2 instance in the same availability zone as the EFS file system. Then I'd install an AWS Data Sync agent in the on-premises data center to automate the data transfer.
A company has an AWS Glue job running daily, processing XML data from an S3 bucket. Currently, it reprocesses all data each time. How can this be prevented?
You can prevent reprocessing by editing the AWS Glue job to use job bookmarks.
How would you design a highly available infrastructure to protect a website running on Windows EC2 instances from a large-scale DDoS attack?
I would use AWS Shield Advanced to mitigate the DDoS attacks and configure Amazon CloudFront to handle both static and dynamic content for the website.
You're deploying a serverless workload and need to follow the principle of least privilege for an AWS Lambda function that's triggered by EventBridge. How would you configure the permissions?
I would add a resource-based policy to the Lambda function, specifying Lambda invoke function as the action and setting the principal to events, aws-saa.
A company needs to store confidential data in Amazon S3, ensure encryption at rest, log key usage for auditing, and rotate keys annually. What's the most efficient solution?
The most efficient solution is server-side encryption with AWS KMS keys using automatic rotation.
A bicycle sharing company needs a multi-tier architecture to track bicycle locations during peak hours, accessible via REST API for analytics. What AWS solution would you recommend for storing and retrieving this location data?
I would recommend using Amazon API Gateway combined with Amazon Kinesis Data Analytics to effectively handle and analyze real-time location data accessible through a REST API.
A company has an automobile sales website using Amazon RDS. When a car is sold, the listing needs removal, and data must be sent to multiple systems. What solution would you recommend?
I would recommend subscribing to an RDS event notification, sending it to an Amazon Simple Queue service queue, then fanning it out to multiple Amazon Simple Notification Service topics, and finally using AWS Lambda functions to update the target systems.
A company wants to store data in Amazon S3 in a way that prevents changes until they explicitly decide to modify it, and only specific users can delete objects. How would you approach this?
I would create an S3 bucket with object lock and versioning enabled, apply a legal hold to the objects, and grant the S3 put object legal hold permission to specific users who need to delete the objects.
How would you improve the performance and reduce coupling for a website that resizes images uploaded by users?
I would configure the web server to upload original images directly to Amazon S3, and then use S3 event notifications to trigger an AWS Lambda function to resize the images after they're uploaded.
A company recently moved a message processing system to AWS involving ActiveMQ queues, consumer EC2 instances, and a MySQL database. They want high availability with low operational complexity. What architecture would you recommend?
I would recommend using Amazon MQ with active and standby brokers across 2 availability zones, placing consumer EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group spanning the 2 availability zones, and using Amazon RDS for MySQL with multi-AZ enabled.
A global company hosts a web application on EC2 instances behind an application load balancer and stores static data in an S3 bucket. How would you improve performance and reduce latency for both static and dynamic data, considering they're using Route 53 for their domain?
I would set up an Amazon CloudFront distribution with the S3 bucket as its origin for static content. Then I'd use AWS Global Accelerator with the application load balancer and CloudFront distribution as endpoints. Finally, I'd create a custom domain name pointing to the Global Accelerator DNS name to serve both static and dynamic content efficiently.
A company needs to move a growing containerized web application from on-premises to AWS with minimal code changes and operational overhead. Which AWS solution would you recommend?
I would recommend using AWS Fargate with Amazon Elastic Container Service, along with service auto-scaling and an application load balancer to distribute incoming requests.
A company needs to transfer 50 terabytes of data to AWS quickly, but their data center lacks network bandwidth for extra workloads. They also run a weekly data transformation job they wish to continue in the cloud. What's the best approach with minimal operational overhead?
I would recommend ordering an AWS Snowball Edge Storage Optimized device, copying the data onto it, and then creating a custom transformation job using AWS Glue.
A company's image analysis app is rapidly gaining users, causing fluctuating demand throughout the day. How would you recommend scaling their infrastructure to handle this growth?
I would suggest using AWS Lambda to process the uploaded photos and storing both the photos and metadata in Amazon DynamoDB to efficiently scale with varying user demand.
A medical records company has EC2 instances in public subnets accessing S3 buckets over the internet. They now require that file transfers happen privately. How would you address this?
I would move the EC2 instances to private subnets and set up a VPC endpoint for Amazon S3. Then I'd link this endpoint to the route table of the private subnets to ensure traffic remains within the AWS network and doesn't go over the internet.
A company wants to redesign its website to reduce maintenance and improve scalability and security. The site updates quarterly and doesn't require dynamic content. What solution would you suggest?
I would recommend creating the new website and hosting it on an Amazon S3 bucket configured for static website hosting. Then, I'd place Amazon CloudFront in front of it to provide HTTPS functionality and enhance security and scalability.
A company needs to store application logs from Amazon CloudWatch logs into Amazon OpenSearch service in near real time with minimal operational overhead. What's the best solution?
The best solution is to create an Amazon Kinesis data firehose delivery stream, set the CloudWatch logs group as its source, and configure Amazon OpenSearch service as the destination.
A company is building a web application on Amazon EC2 instances across multiple availability zones, and it needs scalable storage for around 900 terabytes of text documents. Which AWS storage solution would you recommend as the most cost-effective?
I would recommend Amazon S3 as the most cost-effective solution for this requirement.
How would you protect API Gateway REST APIs from SQL injection and cross-site scripting attacks across multiple accounts and regions with minimal administrative effort?
I would set up AWS WAF in both regions and associate regional web ACLs with the API stages.
A company is using a self-managed DNS solution on EC2 instances behind a network load balancer in the US, and they've recently added similar instances in Europe. How should they route traffic efficiently to these instances?
They should use Amazon Route 53 with a geolocation routing policy to direct requests to the appropriate network load balancer. Then, create an Amazon CloudFront distribution using the Route 53 record as its origin.
A company is running an online transaction processing workload on AWS with an unencrypted RDS database and snapshots. How can they ensure both the database and future snapshots are encrypted?
They should encrypt a copy of the latest database snapshot and then replace the existing database instance by restoring from this encrypted snapshot.
How would you rotate credentials for Amazon RDS databases across multiple AWS regions with minimal operational overhead?
I would store the credentials as secrets in AWS Secrets Manager, use multi-region secret replication for the necessary regions, and configure Secrets Manager to rotate the secrets automatically on a schedule.
How would you design a scalable key management infrastructure to help developers encrypt application data while reducing operational overhead?
I would use AWS Key Management Service, or AWS KMS, to protect the encryption keys as it minimizes operational burden.
A company has a dynamic web application hosted on 2 EC2 instances, and SSL encryption is causing performance issues. How would you address this?
I would import the SSL certificate into AWS Certificate Manager and set up an application load balancer with an HTTPS listener to handle SSL termination.
A company has a dynamic, stateless batch processing job running on many EC2 instances that can start or stop any time without issues. It typically takes about an hour to complete. What would you recommend as a scalable and cost-effective solution?
I would recommend implementing EC2 spot instances, as they provide scalability and cost-effectiveness for stateless batch jobs that can handle interruptions.
A company has a 2-tier e-commerce website on AWS with EC2 instances behind a load balancer and an RDS database. The EC2 instances and RDS database shouldn't be publicly accessible, but the EC2 instances need internet access for payment processing. How would you set this up to ensure high availability?
I'd use an auto-scaling group to launch EC2 instances in public subnets across 2 availability zones and deploy an RDS multi-AZ database instance in private subnets.
A company needs to reduce storage costs on Amazon S3, keeping data highly available for 2 years and archived for at least 25 years. Which solution would you recommend?
I'd recommend setting up an S3 lifecycle policy that transitions objects to S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 2 years.
A media company needs storage solutions on AWS. 10 terabytes with maximum I/O performance for video processing, 300 terabytes of highly durable storage for media content, and 900 terabytes for archiving unused media. Which AWS services would you recommend?
I'd recommend Amazon EBS for maximum performance, Amazon S3 for durable storage, and Amazon S3 Glacier for archival storage.
A company plans to run stateless, containerized applications on AWS. aiming to minimize costs and operational overhead. What solution would you recommend?
I would recommend using spot instances within an Amazon EC2 autoscaling group to run the application containers, as this approach minimizes cost and operational overhead while accommodating the stateless nature of the applications.
A company has a containerized multi-tier web application running on-premises with a PostgreSQL database. They're experiencing high operational overhead and limited growth. How would you improve their infrastructure?
I would migrate the PostgreSQL database to Amazon Aurora and host the web application using AWS Fargate with Amazon Elastic Container Service.
An application runs on EC2 instances behind an application load balancer and performs best at around 40% CPU utilization. How would you ensure this performance is consistently maintained?
I would implement a target tracking policy to dynamically scale the auto-scaling group, keeping CPU utilization close to the desired 40%.
A company wants to use Amazon S3 for file storage and serve these files through CloudFront, but they don't want users accessing files directly via the S3 URL. How would you achieve this?
I would create an origin access identity and assign it to the CloudFront distribution. Then I'd set up the S3 bucket permissions so that only this origin access identity has read access to the bucket.
A company runs an e-commerce app on EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, and the database performance degrades with increased load. How would you address the need for automatic scaling and high availability of the database, considering more read than write requests?
I would recommend using Amazon Aurora with a multi-AZ setup and configuring Aurora autoscaling with Aurora replicas. This approach automatically scales to meet unpredictable read workloads while maintaining high availability.
What solution would you recommend for a company's website that needs to globally scale downloadable historical performance reports while being cost-effective and providing fast response times?
I would recommend using Amazon CloudFront combined with Amazon S3.
A company is migrating an on-premises Oracle database to AWS, aiming to upgrade to the latest version, set up disaster recovery, minimize operational overhead, and maintain operating system access. Which solution would you recommend?
I would recommend migrating the Oracle database to Amazon RDS for Oracle and setting up a standby database in another availability zone. This approach addresses disaster recovery needs and minimizes operational overhead.
A company wants a serverless solution to analyze data stored in Amazon S3 with encryption and replication to another AWS region. What's the best approach with minimal operational overhead?
Create a new S3 bucket, load the data into it, and use S3 cross-region replication to replicate encrypted objects to another region. Use server-side encryption with AWS KMS multi-region keys and query the data using Amazon Athena.
A company needs private, restricted connectivity from its AWS VPC to a service hosted in an external provider's VPC. The connection must be initiated only from the company's side. What solution would you recommend?
I would recommend asking the provider to create a VPC endpoint for the target service and then using AWS Private Link to establish the connection.
A company needs to migrate its PostgreSQL database to Amazon Aurora PostgreSQL without downtime and keep it synchronized during migration. What steps would you take?
I would set up an AWS Database Migration Service Replication Server and use the AWS Schema Conversion tool to convert the database schema.
A company missed an important notification sent to the root user email of an AWS account. How can they prevent missing notifications in the future, ensuring they're limited to account administrators?
They should configure all existing and newly created AWS accounts to use the same root user email address and set up alternate contacts in the AWS organization's console or programmatically.
A company runs an e-commerce application on AWS using RabbitMQ and PostgreSQL on EC2 instances within one availability zone. How would you redesign this architecture to achieve high availability with minimal operational overhead?
I would migrate the RabbitMQ queue to a redundant pair of active standby instances on Amazon MQ. Then I'd set up a multi-AZ auto-scaling group for the EC2 instances hosting the application, and move the PostgreSQL database to a multi-AZ deployment using Amazon RDS.
A reporting team manually moves files daily between two S3 buckets, and now wants to automate this process, run pattern matching code with Lambda, and send data to Amazon SageMaker pipelines. What's the best way to achieve this with minimal operational overhead?
You should create a Lambda function to automatically copy files to the analysis S3 bucket. Then set up an S3 event notification on the analysis bucket with Lambda and SageMaker pipelines as destinations, using the S3 installed object created put event type.
What purchasing options would you recommend to optimize costs for an AWS application using EC2, Fargate, and Lambda, considering the EC2 usage is sporadic and the front-end and API usage is predictable?
I would recommend using Spot instances for the EC2 data ingestion layer since it's sporadic and interruptible, and purchasing a 1-year compute savings plan for the predictable front end hosted on Fargate and the API layer running on Lambda.
A company wants to deliver personalized content globally with minimal latency. How would you design their AWS architecture to achieve this?
I would deploy the application stack in 2 AWS regions and use Amazon Route 53 with a latency routing policy. This would ensure users receive content from the application load balancer in the region closest to them, reducing latency.
A company recently moved to AWS and wants to protect traffic flowing in and out of their production VPC, similar to their on-premises inspection server. How can they achieve this?
They can use AWS Network Firewall to set up rules for inspecting and filtering traffic within their production VPC.
A gaming company wants their UDP-based application to have low latency, static IP addresses, and route traffic efficiently. How would you design this architecture on AWS?
I would use AWS Global Accelerator to forward traffic to a network load balancer and have Amazon EC2 instances running the application within an EC2 auto-scaling group.
A company wants to migrate its monolithic on-premises application to AWS, keeping most of the existing front-end and back-end code intact, but breaking it into smaller team-managed applications. They also need high scalability with minimal operational overhead. What solution would you recommend?
I recommend hosting the application on Amazon Elastic Container Service and setting up an application load balancer with ECS as the target. This approach allows breaking the application into smaller components while maintaining scalability and minimizing operational overhead.
A company using Amazon Aurora for its e-commerce app experiences poor performance during large report runs, causing spikes in red IOPS and CPU utilization. What's the most cost-effective way to address this?
The best approach would be migrating the monthly reporting workload to an Aurora replica to reduce load on the primary database.
A company has a website analytics application hosted on a single EC2 instance running PHP and MySQL. It's experiencing performance issues and errors during peak times. What's the most cost-effective way to scale this application seamlessly?
The most cost-effective solution is to migrate the database to Amazon Aurora MySQL, create an Amazon machine image of the web application, and use this AMI in a launch template. Then set up an auto-scaling group using a spot fleet for cost savings, and attach an application load balancer to distribute traffic effectively.
A company has a stateless web application running on EC2 instances behind an application load balancer. Usage is heavy for 8 hours during weekdays, moderate overnight, and low on weekends. How would you minimize EC2 costs without affecting application availability?
I would use reserved instances to cover the baseline usage and spot instances for any additional capacity required during peak periods.
A company generates over 10 terabytes of logs monthly and needs to retain them for 10 years. Logs older than 1 month are rarely accessed. What's the most cost-effective storage solution on AWS for this scenario?
The most cost-effective solution would be to store the logs in Amazon S3 and use S3 lifecycle policies to automatically move logs older than 1 month to S3 Glacier Deep Archive.
A company's data ingestion workflow using Amazon SNS and AWS Lambda occasionally fails due to network issues, causing missed data unless manually rerun. How would you ensure all notifications are eventually processed?
I would configure an Amazon Simple Queue service queue as the on-failure destination for the Lambda function, and then modify the Lambda function to process messages from this queue.
A company needs to process event data in the exact order it's received, using AWS with minimal operational overhead. How would you set this up?
I would create an Amazon SQS FIFO queue to maintain message order and then set up an AWS Lambda function to process messages from this queue.
The company is migrating an application to Amazon EC2 and needs to monitor infrastructure metrics. They want to avoid false alarms from brief CPU spikes, but they do need alerts when CPU usage is high along with high disk read IOPS. How would you approach this?
I would use Amazon CloudWatch composite alarms, which combine multiple metrics. This approach helps reduce false alarms and ensures alerts only trigger when both CPU utilization and disk read IOPS are simultaneously high.
A company plans to migrate to AWS, but must comply with restrictions of using only the AP Northeast 3 region and no internet access for VPCs. What solutions would you recommend to meet these requirements?
I would recommend using AWS Control Tower to set up data residency guardrails that deny internet access and limit usage exclusively to the AP Northeast 3 region. Additionally, I would use AWS organizations to configure service control policies that prevent VPCs from accessing the internet and restrict region access to AP Northeast 3.
A company has a data lake in AWS with data stored in Amazon S3 and Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL. They need a reporting solution with visualization that restricts full access only to management, while other employees have limited access. How would you approach this?
I would create an AWS glue table and crawler for the data in Amazon S3, then use Amazon Athena Federated Query to access data within Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL. Reports would be generated using Amazon Athena and published to Amazon S3, with access controlled by S3 bucket policies.
A company is setting up a new application on 2 EC2 instances that need access to an S3 bucket. What's the best way to grant this access?
Create an IAM role with permissions to access the S3 bucket and attach this role to the EC2 instances.
Can you describe how you would design a solution to automatically process and compress images uploaded to an S3 bucket using AWS services?
I would first create an Amazon SQS queue and configure the S3 bucket to send notifications to this queue whenever an image is uploaded. Then I'd set up an AWS Lambda function that uses the SQS queue as its trigger. When the Lambda function processes the image successfully, it would delete the corresponding message from the queue.
A company has a 3-tier web application on AWS, with web servers in a public subnet and application and database servers in private subnets. They want to inspect all incoming traffic using a third-party firewall appliance in a separate inspection VPC. What's the best way to integrate this with minimal operational overhead?
Create an application load balancer in the public subnet of the application's VPC and route the incoming traffic through it to the firewall appliance for packet inspection.
How would you efficiently clone large amounts of production data stored on Amazon EBS volumes into a test environment in AWS without impacting production and ensuring high I/O performance?
I would create snapshots of the production EBS volumes, enable the EBS Fast Snapshot Restore feature on these snapshots, then restore them into new EBS volumes and attach these volumes to EC2 instances in the test environment.
How can a company restrict access to an Amazon S3 bucket to only users within its AWS organization, with minimal operational overhead?
They can add the AWS Principal Org ID global condition, key referencing their organization ID, directly into the S3 bucket policy.
An e-commerce company wants to launch a website featuring one product per day, handling millions of requests with minimal latency and low operational overhead. How would you design this solution on AWS?
I would host the website's static content in an Amazon S3 bucket, distribute it using Amazon CloudFront, and use Amazon API Gateway combined with AWS Lambda for backend APIs. I would also store the data in Amazon DynamoDB.
You're designing storage architecture for a digital media application using Amazon S3. The files must withstand the loss of an availability zone, and their access frequency is unpredictable. How would you minimize storage and retrieval costs?
I would choose Amazon S3 Intelligent Tiering, as it automatically moves files between access tiers based on changing access patterns, providing resilience and cost efficiency.
A company frequently accesses backup files stored in Amazon S3 Standard for 1 month, but after that, the files aren't accessed at all. They need to keep these files indefinitely. What's the most cost-effective storage solution?
The most cost-effective solution is to create an S3 lifecycle configuration that moves the files from S3 Standard to S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 1 month.
How would you efficiently analyze an unexpected increase in EC2 costs due to vertical scaling?
I would use the AWS Billing and Cost Management dashboard to compare EC2 costs by instance types over the last 2 months.
A company is using AWS Lambda to handle high volumes of data from API Gateway and store it in an Aurora PostgreSQL database. They had to significantly increase Lambda quotas during testing. How would you redesign this for improved scalability and minimal configuration?
I would set up 2 Lambda functions, one to receive the data and another to load it into the database. I'd integrate them using an Amazon Simple Queue service queue to improve scalability and simplify configuration.
How can a company ensure its Amazon S3 buckets don't experience unauthorized configuration changes?
They should enable AWS Config with the appropriate rules to track and manage configuration changes.
A company needs to provide a product manager without an AWS account secure access to an Amazon CloudWatch dashboard. What's the best way to achieve this following the principle of least privilege?
Create an IAM user specifically for the product manager, attach the CloudWatch read-only access AWS managed policy, and then share the login credentials along with the dashboard URL with the product manager.
A company is migrating applications to AWS and needs a single sign-on solution across multiple accounts while still managing users in its on-premises Active Directory. What approach would you recommend?
I would recommend enabling AWS Single Sign-On from the AWS console and setting up a one-way forest or domain trust between the company's self-managed Microsoft Active Directory and AWS SSO using AWS Directory Service for Microsoft Active Directory.
A company provides a VoIP service using UDP connections hosted on EC2 instances across multiple AWS regions. They want to route users to the region with the lowest latency and need automated failover. How would you design this?
I would deploy a network load balancer with an associated target group linked to the auto-scaling group. Then I'd create an Amazon Route 53 latency record pointing to aliases for each network load balancer and set up an Amazon CloudFront distribution that uses this latency record as its origin.
A development team runs resource-intensive tests monthly on an Amazon RDS for MySQL database. They want to cut costs without reducing computing power. What's the most cost-effective solution?
The best approach is to create a snapshot after the tests finish, terminate the database instance, and then restore it from the snapshot when needed.
An application running on an EC2 instance within a VPC needs to access logs stored in an Amazon S3 bucket without internet connectivity. How would you achieve this private connectivity?
I would create a gateway VPC endpoint to the S3 bucket, allowing the EC2 instance to access S3 privately without internet access.
A company wants to ensure all their EC2 instances, RDS databases, and Redshift clusters have proper tags on AWS. What's the best way to do this with minimal effort?
They should use AWS config rules to define and automatically detect resources that aren't properly tagged.
What's the most cost-effective way to host a website containing HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and images for internal team access?
The most cost-effective approach would be to create an Amazon S3 bucket and host the website there.
A company runs an online marketplace that needs to share transaction details quickly with internal applications and remove sensitive data before storage. How would you approach this using AWS services?
I would stream the transaction data into Amazon Kinesis data streams and use AWS Lambda to remove sensitive information from each transaction. Then, I'd store the sanitized data in Amazon DynamoDB, allowing other internal applications to consume data directly from the Kinesis stream.
How can a company track configuration changes and record API call histories for AWS resources?
The company should use AWS Config to track configuration changes and AWS CloudTrail to record API calls.
What solution would you recommend to detect and protect against large-scale DDoS attacks for a public-facing web application hosted on AWS?
I would recommend enabling AWS Shield Advanced and assigning it to the Elastic Load Balancer.
A company wants to store data in Amazon S3 buckets across 2 AWS regions, encrypting with the same AWS KMS customer managed key. What's the best way to achieve this with minimal operational overhead?
They should create a customer-managed KMS key and an S3 bucket in each region. Set up the buckets with Amazon S3 Managed Encryption Keys, SSE S3, and configure replication between the buckets.
What's the most efficient way to remotely and securely administer Amazon EC2 instances, aligning with AWS best practices?
The best approach would be to attach an appropriate IAM role to each EC2 instance and use AWS Systems Manager Session Manager to create remote SSH sessions.
A company hosts a static website on Amazon S3 with Route 53 DNS and needs to reduce latency for global users cost-effectively. What solution would you recommend?
I would suggest adding an Amazon CloudFront distribution in front of the S3 bucket and updating the Route 53 entries to point to the CloudFront distribution.
A company has a MySQL database on Amazon RDS with over 10 million rows and heavy daily updates. Inserts are sometimes taking more than 10 seconds due to storage performance issues. How would you address this?
I would change the database instance to a memory-optimized instance class to improve performance.
A company needs to ingest and store 1 TB of daily alerts from edge devices, with each alert about 2 KB. They want a highly available, cost-effective solution without managing infrastructure, keeping data available for 14 days, and archiving older data. What's the most efficient solution?
I would use Amazon Kinesis Data Firehose to ingest the alerts directly into an Amazon S3 bucket and configure an S3 lifecycle policy to transition data to Amazon S3 Glacier after 14 days.
A company has 2 EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, each with its own EBS volume containing user-uploaded documents. Users report seeing only some documents each time they refresh. How would you fix this issue?
I would recommend moving the data from both EBS volumes to Amazon EFS and updating the application to store new documents directly in EFS, ensuring all users see the complete set of documents consistently.
A company's application is experiencing slow performance when integrating data from multiple SaaS sources using EC2 instances. How would you improve performance with minimal operational overhead?
I would use Amazon AppFlow to transfer data directly from each SaaS source to an Amazon S3 bucket. Then I'd configure an S3 event notification to send a notification via Amazon SNS once the upload is complete.
A company has EC2 instances across multiple availability zones accessing Amazon S3 through a NAT gateway, leading to high data transfer costs. What's the most cost-effective solution to avoid these charges?
The best solution is to deploy a gateway VPC endpoint for Amazon S3. This would eliminate regional data transfer charges by routing traffic directly to S3 without passing through the NAT gateway.
A company is experiencing bandwidth issues when backing up large, time-sensitive data to Amazon S3, affecting internal users. How would you address this problem?
I would establish an AWS Direct Connect connection and route backup traffic through it. This approach ensures timely backups to S3 without impacting internal internet connectivity.
How would you protect critical data in an Amazon S3 bucket from accidental deletion?
I would enable MFA delete and turn on default encryption for the S3 bucket.
A company's data ingestion workflow occasionally fails due to network issues, causing the Lambda function to miss data ingestion. How would you address this issue?
I would create an Amazon Simple Queue service queue and subscribe it to the existing SNS topic. Then I'd modify the Lambda function to read from the SQS queue, ensuring all data is ingested, even if network failures occur.
A company receives large transaction data files via SFTP, sometimes containing unintended, personally identifiable information. What's an efficient way to detect and handle this issue on AWS?
I would use an Amazon S3 bucket as a secure transfer point and leverage Amazon Makey to scan the uploaded files for personally identifiable information. If PII is found, Amazon Simple Notification Service can notify administrators to remove those files.
If a company needs guaranteed EC2 capacity in specific availability zones for a one-week event, what approach should they take?
They should create an on-demand capacity reservation specifying the region and the 3 availability zones needed.
A company's website uses an EC2 instance store for its catalog and wants higher availability and durability. What would you recommend?
I would recommend moving the catalog to Amazon Elasticache for Redis to ensure high availability and durability.
A company needs quick access to call transcript files within 1 year, but slower access afterward is acceptable. What's the most cost-effective way to store and retrieve these files on AWS?
The best approach would be to store individual files with tags in Amazon S3 standard storage and keep search metadata there as well. Then, use S3 lifecycle policies to move files older than 1 year to S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval. This allows quick querying and retrieval using metadata stored in Amazon S3.
A company needs to quickly patch third-party software on 1,000 Amazon EC2 Linux instances to address a critical security vulnerability. How would you approach this?
I would use AWS Systems Manager Run command to execute a custom command that applies the patch across all EC2 instances.
A company needs to migrate 70 terabytes of video files from on-premises storage to Amazon S3 quickly, using minimal network bandwidth. How would you approach this?
I would deploy an S3 file gateway on premises, set up a public service endpoint to connect it, create an S3 bucket, and then establish a new NFS file share pointing to this bucket. Finally, I'd transfer the data from the existing NFS share to the S3 file gateway.
How would you design a solution to extract shipping statistics from an API, format them into HTML, and email the report daily?
I'd set up an Amazon EventBridge scheduled event to trigger an AWS Lambda function that queries the application's API. Then, I'd store the data in Amazon S3 and configure an Amazon SNS topic as an S3 event destination to send the formatted report via email.
A company wants to migrate an on-premises application to AWS that generates files ranging from gigabytes to terabytes. They need automatic scaling, high availability, minimal operational overhead, and a standard file system structure. What's your recommended solution?
I recommend migrating the application to Amazon EC2 instances within a multi-AZ auto-scaling group and using Amazon Elastic File System for storage.
A company needs to store accounting records in Amazon S3, ensuring immediate access for 1 year, followed by archival storage for an additional 9 years. No users, including administrators, should be able to delete these records during the entire 10-year period. How would you achieve this with maximum resiliency?
I would set up an S3 lifecycle policy to transition the records from S3 standard storage to S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 1 year. Additionally, I'd enable S3 Object Lock in compliance mode for the full 10-year duration to ensure no deletion is possible.
A company wants a highly available and durable storage solution for Windows file shares on AWS, preserving current user access methods. What solution would you recommend?
I would recommend extending the file share environment to Amazon FSx for Windows File Server with a multi-AZ configuration and migrating all data to FSx.
You're designing a VPC with multiple subnets for applications using EC2 instances and RDS databases. How would you ensure only EC2 instances and private subnets can access the RDS databases?
I would create a security group, allowing inbound traffic only from the security group assigned to the EC2 instances in the private subnets, and then attach this security group to the RDS instances.
A company wants third-party services to securely access its APIs, hosted on Amazon API Gateway using HTTPS with its own domain name. How would you set this up?
I would create a regional API gateway endpoint, associate it with the company's domain name, import the domain's public certificate into AWS Certificate Manager in the US East 1 region, attach the certificate to the API Gateway APIs, and then configure Route 53 DNS records to point an A record to the company's domain name.
A company wants to ensure uploaded images on its social media site don't contain inappropriate content with minimal development effort. How would you approach this?
I would use Amazon Recognition to automatically detect inappropriate content and have human reviewers examine any images with low confidence predictions.
How would you recommend running critical applications in containers on AWS, ensuring scalability and availability without managing infrastructure?
I would suggest using Amazon Elastic Container Service with AWS Fargate, as it allows the company to run containers without managing the underlying infrastructure.
How would you handle transmitting and processing over 30 terabytes of daily clickstream data for a company hosting hundreds of global websites and applications?
I would collect the clickstream data using Amazon Kinesis data streams, then use Amazon Kinesis Data Firehose to transfer it into an Amazon S3 data lake. Finally, I'd load the data into Amazon Redshift for analysis.
A company has a website hosted on AWS behind an application load balancer, configured for HTTP and HTTPS separately. How can all incoming HTTP requests be redirected to HTTPS?
You can create a listener rule on the application load balancer to redirect all HTTP requests to HTTPS.
A company needs to handle a highly variable message ingestion rate, sometimes peaking at 100,000 messages per second. They want to decouple their solution and ensure scalability. Which AWS service would you recommend?
I would recommend using Amazon Kinesis Data Analytics to persist the messages and have consumer applications read and process messages from there.
You're developing a two-tier web application on AWS and need to securely manage database credentials without hard coding them, while also automating credential rotation. What's the most efficient way to achieve this?
I'd store the database credentials as a secret in AWS Secrets Manager, enable automatic rotation for the secret, and grant the EC2 instance the necessary permissions to access it.
A company is deploying a public web application behind an application load balancer on AWS. They need to use an SSL TLS certificate from an external certificate authority, rotating it annually before expiration. How would you handle this?
I would import the SSL TLS certificate into AWS Certificate Manager, apply it to the application load balancer, and set up Amazon Event Bridge notifications to alert when the certificate is close to expiring, then rotate it manually.
A company has 700,000 users and needs a scalable solution to convert large PDF files averaging 5 megabytes into JPG images. What's the most cost-effective AWS solution for this?
The most cost-effective solution is to store the PDF files in Amazon S3, then configure an S3 Qt event to trigger an AWS Lambda function. This Lambda function will convert the PDF files to JPG format and store them back in Amazon S3.
A company has over 5 terabytes of data on Windows file servers on premises and needs low latency access from both AWS and on-premises environments. How would you approach migrating this data to AWS with minimal operational overhead and without significantly changing existing file access patterns?
I would deploy and configure Amazon FSx for Windows File Server on AWS, migrate the existing data to FSx, and then reconfigure workloads to access the FSx server directly.
A hospital has deployed a RESTful API using Amazon API Gateway and AWS Lambda to upload PDF and JPEG reports. They need to modify the Lambda function to identify protected health information in these reports with minimal operational overhead. What solution would you recommend?
I recommend using Amazon TextRack to extract text from the reports and then Amazon Comprehend Medical to identify protected health information from that extracted text.
A company stores large numbers of 5 MB files in Amazon S3, frequently accessed in the first 30 days, but rarely afterward. They must remain accessible for 4 years. What's the most cost-effective storage solution?
The most cost-effective solution is to create an S3 bucket lifecycle policy that moves files from S3 standard to S3 standard infrequent access after 30 days, and then deletes them after 4 years.
A company has an application running on multiple EC2 instances that processes messages from an SQS queue and writes them to an RDS table. They're noticing occasional duplicate records in the table, even though the SQS queue has no duplicate messages. How can they ensure each message is processed only once?
They should use the Change Message Visibility API call to increase the visibility timeout, ensuring each message is processed only once.
How would you design a highly available, cost-effective hybrid architecture with low latency between an on-premises infrastructure and AWS?
I would provision an AWS Direct Connect connection for the primary connection and set up a VPN connection as a backup in case the primary Direct Connect connection fails.
A company has a critical web application running on EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, connected to an Aurora PostgreSQL database in a single availability zone. They want high availability with minimal downtime and data loss. What's the simplest approach to achieve this?
The simplest approach is to configure the auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones, set up the Aurora PostgreSQL database as multi-AZ, and use an Amazon RDS proxy instance.
A company's HTTP application behind a network load balancer isn't detecting HTTP errors, requiring manual restarts. How can they improve availability without custom scripts?
They should replace the network load balancer with an application load balancer. Enable HTTP health checks using the application's URL, and configure auto-scaling to automatically replace unhealthy instances.
A company is migrating a distributed application to AWS to handle variable workloads. How would you design an architecture that maximizes resiliency and scalability?
I would implement both the primary server and compute nodes using Amazon EC2 instances managed within an auto-scaling group. I'd configure AWS Cloud Trail as the destination for jobs and set EC2 auto-scaling based on the load on the primary server.
A company uses Amazon DynamoDB for customer data storage and needs a recovery solution with a 15-minute recovery point objective and a 1-hour recovery time objective. What solution would you recommend?
I recommend configuring DynamoDB point-in-time recovery to restore data to the desired point in time and meet these recovery objectives.
A company is experiencing increased data transfer costs when uploading and downloading pictures from Amazon S3 buckets within the same AWS region. How can you reduce these costs?
I would deploy an S3 VPC gateway endpoint into the VPC and attach an endpoint policy to allow access to the S3 buckets.
A company has Linux-based application instances in a private subnet and a Linux-based Bastion host in a public subnet on AWS. How would you set up security groups to securely connect from the company's on-premises network to both the Bastion host and application servers?
I would update the Bastion host's security group to allow inbound access only from the company's external IP range. Then I'd modify the application instance's security group to permit inbound SSH access exclusively from the private IP address of the Bastion host.
You're designing security groups for a 2-tier web application. The web tier is public-facing on EC2 instances, and the database tier runs Microsoft SQL Server on EC2 in a private subnet. How would you configure the security groups for this scenario?
I would configure the web tier security group to allow inbound traffic on port 443 from anywhere. Then, I'd set up the database tier security group to allow inbound traffic on port 1433 only from the web tiers security group.
A company wants to move a multi-tiered application to AWS to enhance performance. The tiers communicate via RESTful services, but transactions drop when a tier is overloaded. How would you design a solution to address this?
I'd use Amazon API Gateway to route transactions directly to AWS Lambda functions for the application layer, and Amazon Simple Queue Service as the communication layer between the application services.
A company generates 10 terabytes of sensitive JSON data daily in a factory and wants to securely transfer it to Amazon S3 for near real-time analytics. What's the most reliable way to handle this transfer?
The most reliable method would be to use AWS Data Sync over AWS Direct Connect.
How would you set up a real-time data ingestion system with minimal operational overhead, including an API, data transformation, and storage?
I would configure an Amazon API Gateway API to send data to an Amazon Kinesis data stream, then use Amazon Kinesis Data Firehose to receive data from the stream. AWS Lambda functions would handle the data transformation, and finally, the transformed data would be stored in Amazon S3.
What is the most efficient way to retain Amazon DynamoDB user transaction data for 7 years?
The most operationally efficient solution is to use AWS Backup to set up backup schedules and retention policies for the DynamoDB table.
A company wants to use Amazon DynamoDB but is worried about costs. The table will mostly be inactive in the mornings, with unpredictable traffic spikes in the evenings. What solution would you recommend?
I would recommend creating a DynamoDB table using on-demand capacity mode. This adjusts automatically to traffic changes, helping optimize costs.
What is the most secure method to share an encrypted Amazon machine image with an AWS managed service provider partner?
The most secure approach is to modify the AMI's launch permission property to share it only with the MSP partner's AWS account, and then update the key policy to permit the MSP partner's AWS account to use the customer-managed AWS KMS key.
A company has an SMB file server nearing its storage capacity. They frequently access recently created large files but rarely access files older than 7 days. How would you address their storage issues while maintaining low-latency access to recent files?
I would install a utility on each user's computer to access Amazon S3 directly and then create an S3 lifecycle policy to move files older than 7 days to S3 Glacier Flexible Retrieval to manage storage effectively.
Can you describe your approach to designing a scalable, loosely coupled cloud architecture for a stateless application on AWS that processes jobs in parallel?
I would use an Amazon SQS queue to store the job items, ensuring durability. I'd create an Amazon machine image containing the stateless processor application, then set up a launch template based on this AMI. Next, I'd configure an auto-scaling group using this launch template, with a scaling policy that adjusts the number of nodes according to the number of items waiting in the SQS queue.
A company hosting web applications on AWS needs to notify its security team 30 days before SSL certificates expire. What approach would you recommend?
I would recommend creating an Amazon Event Bridge rule to detect certificates expiring within 30 days and configuring it to trigger an AWS Lambda function. This Lambda function would then send an alert through Amazon Simple Notification Service.
A company with an on-premises website in the US is launching a product in Europe and wants to optimize load times immediately, while keeping the backend in the US. What solution would you recommend?
I would recommend using Amazon CloudFront with a custom origin that points to the existing on-premises servers.
A company is looking to cut costs for its three-tier web architecture, which currently uses EC2 instances for web, application, and database servers across development, test, and production environments. The production instances run continuously, while the development and test instances run for about 8 hours daily and will be automated to stop when not in use. Which EC2 purchasing option would you recommend to meet these requirements cost-effectively?
I recommend using reserved instances for the production EC2 instances, as they run continuously, and on-demand instances for the development and test environments, since these are used intermittently.
A company needs to ensure uploaded documents can't be modified or deleted after storage due to new regulations. How would you address this requirement?
I would store the documents in an Amazon S3 bucket, enabling both S3 versioning and S3 object lock to prevent modifications or deletions.
A company needs a secure way for web servers to frequently access an Amazon RDS MySQL multi-AZ database with regular rotation of user credentials. How would you approach this?
I would recommend storing the database credentials in AWS Secrets Manager and granting appropriate IAM permissions to the web servers for access. Secrets Manager securely manages credentials and supports automatic rotation.
A company has Lambda functions invoked by an API gateway, saving customer data to an Aurora MySQL database. During database upgrades, the functions fail to connect, causing data loss. How would you address this issue?
I would provision an Amazon RDS proxy between the Lambda functions and the database, then configure the Lambda functions to connect through the RDS proxy. This would handle database connection issues during upgrades and prevent data loss.
A survey company has a 3 TB Amazon S3 bucket that's growing and needs to share data with a European marketing firm's S3 buckets. How can they minimize data transfer costs?
They should set up S3 cross-region replication from their bucket to the marketing firm's S3 bucket.
How can a company secure confidential audit documents stored in Amazon S3 from accidental deletion?
They should enable versioning and the MFA delete feature on the S3 bucket.
A company runs a script that queries an Amazon RDS database at random times, causing performance issues for development tasks. How can they resolve this with minimal operational overhead?
They can use Amazon Elasticache to cache the common queries the script performs, reducing the load on the database.
A company is building an e-commerce web application on AWS and wants to process orders in the exact order they're received. What solution would you recommend?
I would suggest using an API gateway integration to publish a message to an Amazon Simple Notification Service topic when an order is received, and then subscribe an AWS Lambda function to that topic to handle the processing.
A company has EC2 instances in a VPC that need to access Amazon S3 without sending traffic over the internet. How would you achieve this?
I would configure an S3 gateway endpoint within the VPC to securely access S3 without internet traffic.
A company needs secure access to sensitive user data stored in an Amazon S3 bucket from their EC2 instances within a VPC. What steps would you recommend to achieve this?
First, configure a VPC gateway endpoint for Amazon S3 within the VPC. Then, create a bucket policy that restricts access exclusively to the application tier running within that VPC.
A company is migrating an application with heavy database read activity from an on-premises MySQL database to AWS. Currently, every 4 hours, a full export is taken for the staging environment, causing significant latency. How would you recommend resolving this?
I would suggest using Amazon Aurora MySQL with multi-AZ Aurora replicas for production, and then use Aurora's database cloning feature to quickly create the staging database on demand, which would eliminate latency and downtime issues.
Can you describe a solution for quickly processing small files uploaded to Amazon S3 with minimal operational overhead?
Yes, I would configure Amazon S3 to send event notifications to an Amazon SQS queue. Then, I'd use an AWS Lambda function to process the files from the queue and store the transformed data in JSON format in Amazon DynamoDB.
An application using Amazon RDS MySQL is experiencing performance issues due to mixed read and write traffic. How would you quickly optimize performance?
I would create read replicas of the database and configure them with the same compute and storage resources as the source database. This separates read traffic from write traffic and improves performance.
A company is migrating its SharePoint deployment to AWS and needs highly available Windows file storage integrated with Active Directory. Which AWS solution would you recommend?
I would recommend using Amazon FSx for Windows File Server and integrating it with the Active Directory domain for authentication.
An image processing application uploads images to Amazon S3, triggering multiple email notifications per image due to repeated Lambda invocations from an SQS queue. How would you resolve this with minimal operational overhead?
I would set up long polling in the SQS queue by increasing the receive message wait time to 30 seconds.
A company needs a fully managed shared storage solution for a gaming application hosted on premises, with Lustre client access. Which AWS solution would you recommend?
I would recommend creating an Amazon FSx for Lustre file system, attaching it to the origin server, and then connecting the application server to this file system.
A company's application running on EC2 needs to securely handle certificates with minimal operational overhead. How would you approach this?
I'd create an AWS Key Management Service Customer Managed Key, permit the EC2 role to perform encryption operations using this key, and then store the encrypted certificates on Amazon Elastic Block Store volumes.
How would you enable internet access for private subnets in a VPC with public and private subnets across 3 availability zones?
I would create a NAT gateway in each public subnet across the 3 availability zones, then set up private route tables in each zone to forward non-VPC traffic to their respective NAT gateways.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our upcoming videos. See you next time.